Happy Saturday. The Bone Wars are going to get a name drop in an upcoming episode, so we have past hosts episode on that feud as today's Saturday classic. This was originally a 2-part episode, but we are running it all together as one, so just roll with any references that you hear to things like in the next episode or last time.
Also, there's some discussion of George Peabody in this episode, and his name is pronounced differently in different regions. In the Northeast, people mostly say Peabody, like I just said it. But in a lot of the rest of the U.S., it's Peabody, like it's spelled. And those different pronunciations trickle down to all the various institutions named after him, much like how DeKalb County, Georgia, and DeKalb, Illinois are pronounced differently, even though they're named after the same person.
This episode was from hosts Sarah and Deblina, and it originally came out December 31st, 2012, and January 9th, 2013. Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Deblina Chakraborty.
And I'm Sarah Dowdy.
And we have had a lot of fun this year. I've had a lot of fun, at least, covering scientific rivalries. We've talked about Horace Wells and the gas war, and of course, Tesla and Edison and the War of the Currents. That was one that was really popular because it was much anticipated and requested beforehand.
It stirred up a little rivalry on our Facebook page, even.
It did.
Tesla has got a lot of strong support behind it.
Yeah, I was about to say the rivalry's out there, but yeah, Tesla is definitely kind of a favorite these days, I would say. So those episodes and the Mary Anning Princess of Paleontology episode that we did earlier this year got listeners clamoring for a podcast on another scientific war, one about two 19th century paleontologists, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. Now, Cope and Marsh duked it out over America's fossil deposits during a time when the field of paleontology was still pretty new. Their race to find fossils, name the species that they belong to, and publish their findings about all of this came to be known by many names, including the Great Dinosaur Feud, the Dinosaur Rush, and the Bone Wars.
Our title today. And they really made an impact, too. Prior to their work, there were only 9 known species of North American dinosaurs. And these two men's efforts led to the classification of 136 new species. But Cope and Marsh's feud also resulted in a lot more than just the advancement of their field. It was kind of an embarrassment, too. It was a pretty dark time in a lot of ways. It ended up damaging both of their reputations and maybe even hindered scientific progress in some respects.
Yeah, so much so that it's interesting. Their feud has been regarded, quote, as a kind of scientific indiscretion, says James Pennick in an article in American Heritage. So we're going to kind of explore that a little bit. But
in 2 parts.
Yes, we are in 2 parts. But to understand why these guys came to be at such odds, we first need to discuss a little bit about their backgrounds and how they came to be in their field in the first place, because they both took very different paths to end up basically in the same competition.
So we'll start with Marsh. He's the elder of the two. Othniel Charles Marsh was born October 29th, 1831 in Lockport, New York. His father was very poor. He was a farmer, and even though Marsh showed a lot of interest in science from a young age, his father only intended him to take over the family farm someday. But fortunately for Marsh, he had a very influential uncle. His mother, who had died when he was only 3 years old, was the sister of the banker, philanthropist George Peabody.
A much beloved sister.
Yes.
Luckily.
So, of course, Peabody had one of the largest personal fortunes in the world, according to Pennick's article. And it was a good person to have, especially if Marsh's father was kind of struggling with his work.
So around age 21, Marsh inherited some money from his uncle that had been meant for his mother's dowry, and he used this money to attend prep school at Phillips Academy. And of course, at 21, he was much older than the other kids there.
And
so
you think that Peabody could have advanced him the money for the education
a little
earlier.
further ahead of time? Yeah, you would hope so. But That wasn't the case. That didn't happen. So according to an article by Tom Huntington in American History, his peers at prep school gave him nicknames like Daddy and Captain, which you would think would just be mortifying. But he didn't seem to care, or if he did, he didn't let it stop him. He graduated as valedictorian and then convinced his uncle to pay to send him to Yale College, where he earned an undergraduate degree in 1860. He then went on to earn a master's degree from Yale Sheffield School of Science a couple years later.
And after that, he spent a little bit of time studying in Europe and convinced Uncle Peabody to donate some more money, this time to Yale, for a museum of natural sciences. And it was kind of a hard sell because Peabody preferred Harvard. He would have preferred to have given his money to Harvard. But Marsh did get his way in the end, and he was appointed to run the museum as curator and became a professor of paleontology at Yale. So if your uncle does pony up the money, it's a good,
You're a shoo-in
way to
position.
get the job.
Yep.
Ultimately, though, he was the first professor of paleontology in North America, according to Huntington's article. So a big step in his career.
So moving on to Cope, unlike Marsh, Edward Drinker Cope came from a wealthy Quaker family. So definitely a bit of a brighter start in life. He was born July 28th, 1840 in Philadelphia, so 9 years after Marsh. And he also showed a really early interest in science. He actually recorded his impressions of the fossils of an extinct marine reptile called Ichthyosaurus, which I think we talked about a little bit in the Mary Anning episode. Yeah. He recorded his impressions of this when he was only 6 years old.
So he was like you, Deblina, playing fossil hunter.
Yeah, I think it was probably a little more on top of it than I was. But when he was 18, he also published a scientific paper on salamanders. And another thing that set Cope apart from Marsh, though, is that he didn't get a lot in the way of formal education, which is kind of surprising considering he was so into science at an early age. He studied for about a year at the University of Pennsylvania, spent some time studying the herpetology collections of the Smithsonian, and he worked as a researcher at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, but definitely didn't take that sort of traditional academic path that Marsh took.
He did take a little tour through Europe eventually, though, to further his education. To keep Cope from becoming involved in the Civil War, his father sent him abroad to study natural history in 1863. And he ended up for a time at Berlin University in Germany. And coincidentally, Marsh was there at the same time. And the two guys did become acquainted. And even though it seems really unbelievable later, they were actually friendly with each other, and they continued their friendship stateside, after they returned home, even though their lives did take somewhat different paths.
Yeah, Marsh, of course, came back, and he had this nice cush position at Yale to come into, and Cope came back to marry his cousin, Annie Pern, and he became a professor of zoology and botany at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. That position, however, was pretty short-lived. Cope left it in 1867 to go study a big deposit of dinosaur fossils found in New Jersey. So just a little background on the study of dinosaurs up to this point. According to Huntington's article, a British scientist named Richard Owen had coined the term dinosaur in 1841, but he had described them as these, quote, low-slung, lizard-like creatures. Joseph Leidy's study of the first U.S. dinosaur find in Haddonfield, New Jersey in 1858 totally changed this perception. Leidy worked with the bones of a hadrosaurus and showed that it would have walked erect on two legs instead of on all fours like a lizard, like most people thought. And that first hadrosaurus, which Leidy helped reconstruct, became the first complete dinosaur skeleton to be displayed for the public, according to PBS.org.
Well, and Leidy had a connection to one of these guys, too, didn't he?
He did. He had been Cope's anatomy professor at the University of Pennsylvania and was also his mentor at the Academy of Natural Sciences, so probably someone that Cope looked up to and learned from.
Yeah, and if you're only going to do 1 year at Penn, it was good he met this guy. But ultimately, Cope did go to New Jersey, where this fossil quarry was, and he participated in several excavations there. So at this point, as we mentioned, Cope and Marsh were still friendly with each other, enough so that in 1867, Cope even named an amphibian fossil, Petonius marshi, after Marsh. I mean, that's a pretty Nice thing to do for your fellow scientist, I would say. He also spent a week or so in 1868 showing Marsh around the fossil quarry in New Jersey where he was working, pointing out his various collection sites, really being open about his work with Marsh, something important to remember later on. That year, too, Marsh wasn't just going to take this gift of a dinosaur name and let it go. He returned the naming compliment, and according to PBS.org, gave a, quote, new and gigantic serpent from the tertiary of New Jersey the name Mosasaurus copianus. That gesture didn't count for a whole lot in the long run, but still, it's a gesture.
Yeah, so just to give you a little background of why it might not have been as sweet a gesture as it seemed, Cope later found out that Marsh had gone behind his back and made a deal with the New Jersey quarry owner that ensured that all of the fossils that were found there would go directly to Marsh first, so basically cutting Cope out of the loop, cut him out of the process.
So Cope is taking him around this place, showing off what he's working on, giving them the tour.
Yeah, supposedly, I guess, being totally open about it, not assuming that Marsh is going to backstab him, but that's exactly what happens. So Cope was kind of hoodwinked by this. In the same year, in 1868, something else happened in their relationship, in Cope and Marsh's relationship. Cope was in a big hurry to publish his findings on a new species of plesiosaur, the fossilized bones of which had been shipped to him by an army surgeon from Kansas. And this is how they received their fossils sometimes.
This reminded me a little bit of the Mary Anning episode where, of course, the earlier situation we were describing of Cope going to the dig site and looking himself sounds more like what you'd expect, but just having bone shipped to you from somebody else.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the bone collectors and so forth a little more in part 2 of this, but this sort of introduces that idea. But anyway, Cope, he got these bones. He called this previously unknown plesiosaur Elasmosaurus. Unfortunately, though, when Cope was reconstructing the Elasmosaurus skeleton, he made a pretty major error. He reversed all of the vertebrae and put its head on its tail instead of on the end of its neck.
It's pretty bad. And guess who noticed? Marsh paid a visit to the Academy of Natural Sciences to check out Cope's work. And of course, he did not hesitate to point out this error. And he's even said to have been the first person to point it out to Cope. Cope called in Joseph Leidy to take another look and offer up a second opinion. He confirmed the mistake. And actually, upon looking at the skeleton, Leidy removed the head and reversed it with what Cope had originally thought was the tail. So pretty bad.
Yeah, and Leidy also discussed this error at the next meeting of the Academy of Natural Sciences. So you can imagine it's just like embarrassment on top of embarrassment. First, he's embarrassed.
His mentor.
Yes, he's embarrassed in front of his colleague. Then he's embarrassed in front of his mentor. And then
at the Academy of Natural Sciences.
In front of this entire meeting of scientists. And of course, also, it's in publication, as we mentioned before. It's already out there in the Journal of the American Philosophical Society. They had already published his findings, including a drawing of this incorrect restoration. So Cope frantically starts to try to buy back every copy of the publication that he could find. But this incident, combined with Marsh's shady dealings regarding the New Jersey quarry, really seemed to have kicked off the feud between the two, or at least started the rift and bad feelings between them. But if you really look at which of these incidents had more to do with the bad feelings between them, it really depends on which one of them that you asked. I mean, Cope would probably say it had more to do with what happened in New Jersey.
The fossil issue.
Yes, and Marsh would say that he was just embarrassed and mad that he had pointed out his mistake.
Yeah, well, Marsh even later wrote of the incident and said that it was Cope's, quote, wounded vanity that had received a shock from which it never recovered. And he has since been my bitter enemy. So, yeah, that's Marsh saying, oh, Cope just couldn't handle being wrong, essentially. He also later admitted that while he initially did return his copy of the publication to Cope, as Cope had requested, trying to hoard all these incorrect copies, Marsh later sought out and bought 2 additional copies, which he did hang on to, as if he wanted to have them as some kind of ammunition. Seems like something that your buddy wouldn't do.
No, only your most bitter enemy would do that, or at least you would hope. But this is a great example of how Cope's big rush to get things published sometimes resulted in him making errors. But of course, Marsh, although he was said to be very meticulous, wasn't immune to this either. He did make his share of mistakes. Just one example, he once put a Camarasaurus skull on the skeleton of an Apatosaurus, which, according to an article by Renee Clary, James Wandersee, and Amy Carpinelli in Science Scope, was, quote, one of the longest-lasting mistakes of paleontology. And we're going to discuss at least one of his other major errors later on too, but that's just to give you one example.
And so, of course, in some ways, we've been talking about this rush that both of the men were constantly under. These errors were a direct result of competition between them, because not only were they trying to get their discoveries out there quickly, because the naming rights were given to whoever published a find first. They were trying specifically to beat each other to the punch. I mean, that's not going to make great meticulous work in the end, most likely.
Right. The feud between Cope and Marsh really began in earnest in the 1870s when they both headed west to hunt for fossils. Marsh's first expedition was in 1870, and it was sponsored by Yale, and he had this whole entourage with him, including about a dozen Yale students and even an army escort that they acquired once they'd made it to what's now the Midwest. And they explored Kansas, Wyoming, and Utah, and according to Huntington's article, at one point they even had Buffalo Bill Cody as their guide. But by the time they got back to Yale after that first trip, they had 36 boxes of specimens, including bone fragments from a pterodactyl wing, when no pterodactyl had been discovered before. And Marsh estimated that this giant flying reptile would have had a wingspan of 20 feet. So Cope and Marsh, when they really started to butt heads, was around 1872, when Cope started exploring Wyoming territory looking for fossils there. Huntington writes that Marsh was really angry about this because he considered the area his turf. I guess because he'd already hunted for fossils around there.
Taste of his own medicine there, I have to say. But this ultimately kicked off a really nasty sort of letter writing campaign between the two. It reminds me of the pamphlet wars we sometimes discuss on the podcast. But their war tactics were not just limited to words either. They employed everything from espionage to theft in their battle to be known as the best in the field. And I think to a certain extent to make sure the other guy was number two too, or even lower. Right. So we're going to be discussing examples of some of these tactics in the next episode, as well as what happens when Cope and Marsh finally take their fight to what turned out to be the ultimate battleground for them. And it was not some fossil ground. It was Washington, D.C.
Yeah, so lots of interesting things to cover in part 2, including, I think we'll talk a little bit more just about their personalities too and their personal lives, because I think it gives some interesting insight as to maybe some more of the root of the animosity. It wasn't necessarily all about dinosaur bones.
Not all about it.
No.
But a lot.
A lot, yes, that's for sure.
When we left them off, Cope and Marsh had just started to look west in search of fossils. In this episode, though, we're going to be talking a bit about what they found out west and the sometimes shady tactics that they employed to be the first to get credit for their discoveries. We're also going to take a look at the more official stage on which their battle played out and where it got truly, truly nasty. But first, we want to take a closer look at who these guys were, because it might help provide at least a little more insight as to why they were destined to clash in the first place, the clash of the dinosaur hunters.
Okay, so we've already talked about the differences between Cope and Marsh's socioeconomic backgrounds and their educational training, which is kind of where it all started. And if you'll recall, Marsh was poor, raised on a farm until his uncle George Peabody stepped in with the financial support that Marsh needed to go to prep school and then on to Yale. And it's Peabody's generous donation at Marsh's request that also led to the creation of a Museum of Natural Sciences at Yale, which was a move that then helped secure Marsh a professorship there. And it created a great resource for him while he was hunting for fossils.
Yeah, he had Yale in his corner. But all of Peabody's support did unfortunately come with a catch, according to an article by James Pennick in American Heritage. It turned out that Uncle George had a certain stipulation for anyone named in his will, and that stipulation involved marriage. When he was 25 and a freshman at Yale, Marsh received a letter from his aunt indicating this stipulation, and it read, quote, "If any of his nephews should in any way conduct himself as to disgrace themselves and him, or, now mind this, should any of them form a marriage connection or even get engaged before they had the means of supporting a family, they should never have a cent of his money. He desired me to communicate this to all his nephews."
Yeah, and apparently there was one other nephew who had gotten cut out of the will for marrying too soon. So Peabody was serious about this.
It was put to the test.
By the time Marsh was financially independent, he was well into his 30s. So Pennick kind of suggests maybe he was too set in his ways to marry at that point, or, just wasn't inclined to do so.
Or just that he had this strange break on his life until he could be financially independent.
Right.
He had some other friendly sort of issues, though.
Yeah, just basically the issue was that he didn't have many friends. According to an article by Tom Huntington in American History, people found Marsh to be, quote, autocratic and petty, and accused him of taking credit for the work of his assistants and for falling behind on paying his employees, never a good move. At one of his clubs, they apparently nicknamed him, quote, the Great Dismal Swamp.
That's a bad sign.
Yeah. He doesn't do well with the nicknames,
No,
Marsh.
he really doesn't, except for the Bone Wars. It's a pretty great nickname for his rivalry.
True.
Cope, on the other hand, came from a very different kind of background, which we discussed on the last podcast. It was a more privileged beginning. If you remember in the last episode, though, he didn't have a lot of formal education. He was self-taught, and he was a part of this whole gentleman's world of natural science that existed in the 19th century. Deblina and I were talking about it earlier, how it just fascinates us that gentlemen would choose to pursue science in some form.
And there's something very romantic about it. I mean, we both talked about how there's something very ideal about it.
A little
that
troubling,
lifestyle.
too, because you end up with personal disputes like this. But Cope was considered to be very brilliant, considered to be a prodigy. And his life was also very different from Marsh's on a personal level, too. We mentioned that he was married. He had a wife. He had a daughter named Julia. Unlike Marsh, too, Cope was pretty charming. The friends he had seemed to really like him, really care for him, although they would agree that he could kind of be arrogant sometimes. He could be quick-tempered. According to Huntington's article, paleontologist William Berryman Scott, who took Cope's side in the war with Marsh, said of Cope, quote, "Despite his greatness, in some measure indeed because of it, he had some unfortunate personal peculiarities, was pugnacious and quarrelsome, and made many enemies." So many enemies, many friends, no friends on the other side, kind of unusual guys.
So when we last left off with our story, Cope had kind of broken the mold of those gentleman naturalists that we were describing. They usually waited for things to be sent to them to study. They didn't actually go out on these great expeditions.
They limit their study to the comfort of their own home.
Exactly. And Cope, like Marsh, went out to hunt fossils, but he had a different way of traveling from Marsh. We mentioned how Marsh went out with this entourage and had guides and a military escort. Cope did not have a resource like Yale behind him, so he didn't have all these graduate assistants to come with him. So he often put together teams for his expeditions when he got wherever he was going. Also, since Cope was a Quaker, he rarely used a military escort because he was a pacifist, and he pretty much refused to carry a revolver, which a lot of people thought was crazy because of the threat of hostile Native American tribes out west, among other things.
Yeah, bandits, highwaymen, all sorts of risks you might come across, not to mention just the wildlife, potentially.
Exactly.
Cope did things his way, though, and he was very tough about it. Pennick relates how Cope would read the Bible every night, even when he was out in the field, and if others in his camp would laugh at him, he'd sort of stare them down until they would just straighten up, stop laughing, stop making fun of him. Cope and Marsh did both have successes in the field, though. We've kind of described the way they carried about their expeditions, but they did both have successes, though Marsh, of course, with his official Yale connection and his Peabody inheritance at his disposal, did have more resources to throw at the situation. However, both, to some extent, Cope especially, were reliant on being associated with one of several geological surveys of the West that were going on at the time. It was kind of an official backing almost.
Yeah, being involved with these surveys provided economic support for their work and a vehicle for publishing their findings. And this becomes important later in our story as well. So just kind of remember that. We talked a little in the last podcast also about how Marsh and Cope started going at each other, mostly by way of letters after their initial expeditions out west, when they started really competing, in a sense, for fossil finds out there. But they really launched into full-scale warfare in 1877 when Arthur Lakes, who was a mining teacher, wrote to Marsh saying that he'd discovered some fossils near Morris in Colorado. Now, Marsh didn't reply, so Lakes said, well, okay, I want to do something with these, so he sent some samples to Cope. When Marsh heard that, though, he sent Lakes some cash to win him over. He was like, well, I don't want Cope to get these. After that, after getting that cash, Lakes asked Cope to please send back his samples so that he could work with Marsh. And according to Huntington, part of what Marsh found among Lakes' initial find were the first remains of a Stegosaurus.
Around the same time, too, another teacher named O.W. Lucas also found some fossils in Colorado. He contacted Cope first about it, and Cope jumped at the chance to check out the fossils. Overall, according to Huntington, Cope's Colorado finds actually turned out to be better than Marsh's because they were bigger and they could be taken out of the surrounding rock without breaking them. Marsh, of course, though, did come out on top in other situations. In the summer of 1877, for example, 2 railway workers in Como, Wyoming, named William Reed and W.E. Carlin, contacted Marsh about some fossils that they had discovered at a site known as Como Bluff. And Marsh, of course, sent his bone collectors out there. They ended up gathering 30 tons of fossils from the Jurassic Age and shipped all the stuff back to Marsh at Yale. And it was very high quality, large bones. It was well preserved. The result of Marsh's investigation of this find, too, really speaks to how high quality it was. He discovered several new species and named the Allosaurus, the Diplodocus, the Camptosaurus, all from those Como Bluff finds.
And also, notably, he named the Brontosaurus out of those finds, one of the world's best-known dinosaurs and Sarah Dowdy's favorite dinosaur, I should mention. Interesting, though, that the naming of Brontosaurus is actually considered one of Marsh's biggest mistakes. After he died, scientists realized that the creature Marsh had named Brontosaurus was just another example of a dinosaur Marsh had already named, the Apatosaurus. So the designation Brontosaurus was taken away. Obviously, though, that's kind of an enduring
kind of stuck
mistake.
Around.
Yes. So it's probably clear by now that Cope and Marsh often weren't the ones actually digging in the ground collecting fossils or even supervising digs themselves, hence all the talk of sending bones back east to them. They accomplished a lot of what they did through the help of bone collectors. Cope and Marsh would occasionally visit the dig sites, but the fossil collectors were sort of the foot soldiers in this battle that they were waging against each other, too.
There really was a lot of taking sides. Reed took Marsh's side and became a major collector for him, while Carlin switched over to Cope's side. Lucas remained on Cope's side, while Lakes stuck with Marsh. I was surprised by Lucas, I think, since he sort of got slighted at the beginning by Marsh, but I guess
I was too.
The pay might have been better.
Yeah, I mean, that means a lot.
It does. Occasionally, though, according to Huntington again, the 2 paleontologists would try to woo each other's collectors away from the other. I don't know if they were tempting them with better publication of the works or money all the time, but that wasn't the most extreme of the tactics used in this war. I mean, that already sounds a little bit dicey. But they also spied on each other. Marsh, at least, would even communicate in code with his collectors to try to keep Cope from figuring out what he was up to, what his bone collectors were up to. They referred to Cope as Jones in this sneaky correspondence. And one of Marsh's guys was so paranoid about Cope spying on him that when a man showed up at their camp one day in 1878, he asked for a handwriting sample in case it was Cope in disguise. He was so suspicious.
So I guess they were right to worry, though, because Cope really did charm his way into one of Marsh's camps in 1879, probably to woo some team members over to his side or just to steal information outright. But the funny thing was, Marsh's men really liked Cope. According to Huntington's article, Lakes later wrote of the incident that Cope, quote, entertained his party by singing comic songs with a refrain at the end like the howl of a coyote. And Lakes went on to observe, quote, I must say that what I saw of him I liked very much. His manner is so affable and his conversation very agreeable. I only wish I could feel sure he had a sound reputation for honesty.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
According to an article by Renee Clary, James Wandersee, and Amy Capernelli in Science Scope, Marsh was said to have planted unrelated fossils at some of Cope's dig sites to slow down his progress, too. So it's not just invading the other guy's camp. And
no reputation for honesty there either.
That takes it to another level, though.
It does.
Tampering with the science, essentially.
Yeah, and that was the really shocking part of Cope and Marsh's tactics, is that they went beyond trying to harm and hinder each other in their efforts. They actually may have harmed the field itself, or maybe even hindered scientific progress in some cases. For example, if Marsh's guy Reed unearthed more bones than he could use, he smashed them so that Carlin couldn't get to them.
Marsh is also said to have ordered that certain sites be blown up with dynamite to keep Cope from getting to the fossils. Although, according to a 2008 article by Genevieve Rujewski, at least when it comes to one of the sites that was supposedly blown up, Quarry 10, which is in Morrison, Colorado, those allegations are false. Some researchers found Quarry 10 in 2002 using Lakes' field notes and determined that Lakes probably just shoved some dirt in there and then said he dynamited it to discourage the competition from checking it out. The way I sort of read that, though, is maybe he had his history of dynamiting things already established, though, if people were going to believe that.
Could be. Well, it may have been out west that some of the more colorful war tactics were used by these two. As we hinted in the previous episode, the really decisive battleground for the Bone Wars turned out to be Washington, D.C. And this is where Marsh really pulled ahead, because even though he wasn't winning any popularity contests, he was much savvier when it came to politics than Cope was. The first development that really set the ball rolling for Marsh had to do with those surveys out west that we talked about earlier. In the late 1870s, early 1880s or so, Congress, upon the advice of the National Academy of Sciences, which, by the way, was an organization which Marsh had become president of, decided to do away with all of the existing competing geological surveys and create just one National Geological Survey to replace them.
They decided to call it the United States Geological Survey, and the former head of one of the defunct surveys Marsh had been affiliated with was named as the director. So soon, Marsh became the official vertebrate paleontologist of the United States Geological Survey. Not too surprising there. If he's the head of the National Academy of Sciences already, he knows the new head of the Geological Survey. He was certainly at this point winning the feud in terms of political clout in the science world, in terms of how his career was progressing. When Cope lost that government support, it really devastated his research, too, and his publication efforts. He just didn't have any funding anymore, and his personal wealth, which he had also put toward his effort efforts in paleontology over all these years was starting to dry up. Cope, looking for a get-rich-quick sort of scheme, tried to make up for it by investing in a silver mine in New Mexico, but that turned out to be a bust. He lost everything, and it really seemed at this point that there was a clear winner and loser in this feud.
But that didn't seem to be enough for Marsh. He took things a step further and tried to have Cope's fossils confiscated, claiming that they'd been collected with government funds. Cope completely denied this. He said that he had used his own money to collect the fossils. And then he decided to fight back against Marsh in the only way that he could at that point, and that was through the press. He approached a writer for the New York Herald and told that writer basically every bad thing that he had ever thought or heard about Marsh. And this kicked off a very public, very brutal battle of words between Cope and Marsh that was splashed all over the pages of the New York Herald between January 12th, 1880 and January 26th, 1880, under headlines like "Scientists Wage Bitter Warfare."
And they went way back in their relationship, too. They weren't just considering the last few years as their ammo. They went back to the beginning. According to Huntington's article, Cope said things like Marsh was, quote, unable to properly classify and name the fossils his explorers secured. It's pretty damning. He said that Marsh took credit for his assistant's work, and he also accused Marsh and the U.S. Geological Survey of corruption and misuse of government funds, which is pretty key here. For his part, Marsh brought up how Cope rushed to get his discoveries into print, before they were ready, often making errors in the process. He also brought up that embarrassing mistake with the elasmosaur, among other things. We discussed that in the last podcast, flipping the head and tail of the dinosaur and then having Marsh be the one to point it out.
This newspaper feud didn't last long, but it was really damaging to both of their reputations, so nobody won in this instance. Cope struggled to find a buyer for his massive fossil collection because he needed the money. Eventually, he could only sell part of it, and then he hit the lecture circuit and tried to secure a paying position at a college. He didn't have that backing behind him that Marsh had at Yale. I think I saw him described in one spot as a rogue scientist or a rogue paleontologist.
And now he has all this bad press out, too.
Exactly. So doubly, he just doesn't have anyone to go to at that point. It just proved to be really tough to find a paying position. According to Pennock's article, he finally got a position, though, and a small salary at the University of Pennsylvania in 1889, and he turned out to be a pretty good teacher, but of course that wasn't his life's goal. That's not what he had really wanted. He died in 1897 of renal failure at age 56.
According to PBS, and not right away, but in a couple years, Congress did investigate the U.S. Geological Survey's use of funds and ended up cutting their funding and completely doing away with the Department of Paleontology. Marsh was forced to resign, and for the first time, he had to accept a salary from Yale. He died of pneumonia in 1899, 2 years after Marsh, at the age of 67. He only had $186 in his bank account when he died of all that Peabody money that had come to him. His collection ended up in the Smithsonian and at Yale, and part of Cope's collection ended up at the American Museum of Natural History. That's those are the two or the three winners in this story, I think. The places and us, too, that we can go see them today.
Yeah, and that there's this interesting story for us to look into. But looking at this result, there doesn't really seem to be like a winner at the end. Neither of these guys seem to really come out on top. But of course, they were both very accomplished overall, and they both made major contributions to science. If you stack up some of their accomplishments, though, side by side, what does it look like? We wanted to take a look at that. So first, we'll look at the naming part of it. Well, Marsh seemed to win when it came to naming dinosaur species. He named 86 out of the 130 some odd ones that they named total. Cope published more, though. According to Science Scope, his record of 1,200 publications is still unbeaten.
Wow. I mean, I guess that is not too surprising. He won that side of the battle. Marsh notably provided evidence for the theory of evolution, too, which Darwin himself called, quote, the best support of the theory of evolution. at the time. He found 30 specimens, for example, that allowed him to outline the evolutionary history of the horse, and he recognized similarities of the modern bird in extinct dinosaurs.
Cope, on the other hand, because of his religious convictions, probably didn't support Darwin's theory, but as Science Scope points out, he's known for Cope's rule, which is the observation that organisms of a species tend to get larger over time in the fossil record. So it just depends on what you're judging them by, which one of them won.
Yeah, and it certainly made me wonder, too, how much they accomplished because they did have the other one there competing and egging him on, or whether they could have accomplished more if they had worked in better concert together than they did, not trying to sabotage each other's work as much.
No, but it's interesting. Just another tidbit here. Their competition continued a little bit even after the grave. About a century after Cope's death, National Geographic photographer Luis Sohoyos got Cope's skull from the University of Pennsylvania. Cope had willed his body to science, so this was available. And he took the skull with him as he traveled around the world interviewing paleontologists for a book. And he referred to the skull as he was doing this as Eddie. Later, he and paleontologist Robert Baker tried to have Cope's skull named as the type specimen, which means that it would have been the standard of a species to which all others are compared. He wanted to have it named as the type specimen for Homo sapiens. But it turned out that the late botanist Carolus Linnaeus had already been named the type specimen for Homo sapiens.
So thank goodness for Linnaeus, able to step in there with his skull and stop this feud from continuing after death.
Yeah, I read elsewhere that one reason that Cope willed his body to science is that he wanted them to compare his skull size to Marsh's after Marsh died. But Marsh didn't leave any sort of
That's so weird.
instructions to have his skull studied after the fact. So they didn't ever get to resolve that question.
I think that's for the best.
Yeah, it's better just to look at the story, look at their accomplishments, and decide for yourself, I think, who's the winner. But I'm curious for listeners to write in and tell us if they have a favorite in this war. I know that in the War of the Currents, for example, Tesla was the overwhelming favorite among our listeners, at least. And so I wonder, Cope or Marsh? Do you have a favorite, Sarah? Who do you think you would have been pals with?
I don't know. Do I pick the guy who didn't have any friends? I mean, odds are.
Well, you're a nice person, so I could see
that.
So
I could have made friends with Marsh. I don't know. I found myself during this story kind of rooting for each of them and feeling bad
points.
for each of them, and then thinking that they were each terrible, terrible people. So maybe I'll pass on this.
Yeah, okay. You're pleading the fifth.
Yeah. Do you have a pick?
I mean, I guess I sort of agree with you, although I found myself sympathizing with Cope a little bit more. And maybe it's because some of the articles that I read were more biased in that direction. Mm-hmm. But I think it may also have a lot to do with the fact that, at least from what I read, from the evidence that I saw, it seemed that Marsh kind of did the dirtier stuff, like the dynamiting of dig sites. I didn't like that at all. So
no, that's not cool.
Thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday. Since this episode is out of the archive, if you heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar over the course of the show, that could be obsolete now. Our current email address is historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can find us all over social media at Missed in History. And you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.